Some of the things that are going on as a society. Are we ready, Glenn?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Without further ado.
Okay.
Let me introduce Kathy, who will tell us about Laura Elms.
Absolutely. Welcome, and it's great to see so many people out, and I thank you for coming. And I thank Glenn for doing what he's doing, getting us up to speed. Who was Laura Elms Morris? Well, she was a mother. She was a sister of a West Point graduate. She was a teacher who found herself in the midst of a national spotlight after a whirlwind of controversy. And she was an amateur genealogist. She was determined when confronted, she was driven to succeed, and she was relentless in her quest to complete mountains of research on the Morris family. Besides all of these roles, she left a huge body of invaluable material here at the Cornerstone Library. Now, how did I get involved? Well, I have vague memories from my childhood surrounding the Elms family. My father spoke of an old blacksmith shop beside the Elms home near our farm in Fordyce. My grandmother, who lived to be 101, spoke about Laura's sister being a friend of my aunt. And my mother spoke about Laura being her librarian at Jefferson Morgan High School. I might have met her once or twice, but by the time I was born, she had left the village of Fordyce. The distinctive feature that I remember about her was her hair. Slide. And she always had lots of hair, and it was always piled on top of her head so neatly. There she is in 54. When I was a young teacher in the 80s, Jim and Mary Hawkins, who many of you know as volunteers here at Cornerstone, they were very good friends of my parents, they gave my parents a transcript of a trial in which Laura was accused of teaching evolution. And I put it away. I didn't think any more about it until about 5 years ago, and David was looking for materials on teachers and schools in Greene County for a Clues edition. And so my quest to unravel the mystery of Laura Elms Morris came when David asked me to write that article about the trial for the Clues. Later I did more research here in the library, and David steered me to a bunch of manuscripts. They had been compiled by Laura in the 30s, just pages and pages of cursive script on Morris families throughout the Greene County and beyond. These manuscripts were all handwritten, in ink, notebook paper, front and back. Pages and pages of them. David's brilliant suggestion, don't turn the page yet. David's brilliant suggestion was for me to type these manuscripts to make it easier for researchers to access. Well, he was lucky that COVID came along because I was locked in my office typing, and to date I've gotten about 100 pages typed, but I'm not even halfway done, and I hope to finish this sometime in the near future. We hope. Anyway, slide. Go back one.
Skip one.
Okay. Here we have from the Caldwell Atlas, 1876. We have what's called Morris Crossroads. Today it's known as Fordyce. But back then it was called Murdoch's Crossroads because right here is a little country store. It also had a post office in it. And that store is still here today. Back then it was owned by the Murdochs. But it's still there today, and it's what we could call the Dutch House. And many of you have seen this on Facebook and in the newspapers, but the Dutch House is an antique store, and that's where it is. There were other businesses around it. There was a shoe shop, there was a Cooper and whatever. But anyway, they called it Murdoch's Crossroads. If you went to the left, you went to Waynesburg, to the right, Gerard's Ford, and nowadays we call this Gerard's Ford Road. If you come across the crossroads, you see the Fordyce Methodist Church, you see the parsonage, and come on up the hill, and here is the George Elms home. George Elms was Laura's grandfather, and he moved there in 1865 after the Civil War. He was a blacksmith, And here's his blacksmith shop right here. Laura's father was born there, and Laura was born there in 1893. All the property where it says Whiteley Township, and the property up on the upper part of the screen that says Green Township, with the exception of these little residential lots, belongs to our Morris family bicentennial farm. So you can see that the Morrises were in close proximity to the Elms. Slide. Here we have two photographs. The one over here on the right is taken just about the same, for the same view as the Caldwell Atlas. All of this cornfield right here and all up along the horizon on the right, all of that still belongs to our farm. And the Elms home was actually in this corner. You can't see it, but that's where that Elms home was. Down here you see the store. Here's the road going to Waynesburg down to Gerard's Fort. Come across the crossroads, and here is the Fordyce Methodist Church. Now that's the first church that was there. In 1923, they demolished that and they built a brick church, which still stands, and it's 100 years old this year. Here's the parsonage, and as I said, the Elms home would be right in here. Now the thing that you see in this picture that you didn't see in the Caldwell Atlas is the little schoolhouse right there. That's the Moordock School. Presently, that is the headquarters of the Warrior Trail. Also notice how clear all of this land is here, with farms, clear as far as the eye can see. Well, it's not anymore because it belongs to the state game lands. And Dick, did you buy that?
It did, yes.
Okay, this is the man that's responsible for that being wooded. Okay, but anyway, that was Fordyce. So we know that this picture was taken before 1923, because that's when the church changed. Now, if you look at this picture right here, this is the reverse image of that. It was taken probably right in front of the Moordock store. Here's the back of the Warrior Trail, the Moordock Schoolhouse. The road going to Waynesburg, the road going to Gerard's Fort. Here is the Fordyce Methodist Church. Here's the parsonage. And up on the hill is the house that Laura Elms was born in. Her father moved there in 1865 after the Civil War. And across the street, across the road, is the blacksmith shop. He was a blacksmith and her father was a blacksmith, and we'll learn more about that later. But anyway, that is the village of Fordyce. Here, you can see all of this land here. This all belongs to our farm. The Elms, as far as I know, did not farm, but they were in close proximity to us. Slide. I got most of my information about Laura from a 28-page manuscript that was housed here in Cornerstone. And
Wow.
are we having trouble?
We are.
Uh-oh. All right, where's Jim Fordyce?
Wow.
Anyway, I'll go on. There you go, okay. This 28-page manuscript was written by Laura, and it's minute details, anything and everything you'd ever want to know about the Elms family, starting with their lineage in Somersetshire, England. She got her information from her father, who got it from his father. Now, the Elms were of Nordic origin, and they emigrated from Normandy, France to England. And according to Laura, they were tradespeople. John Elms was Laura's great-grandfather, and he was a nurseryman, and he had seagoing ships. He married Lady Margaret Griffith, and she was landed gentry. They lived on an estate. They had servants. They had tutors for their children. They had a lot of children. One of the children was George. This is Laura's grandfather. Now, apparently Lady Margaret's family did not approve of this marriage because John had many vices. Wine, fast women, fast racehorses, and he often brought the fast women home for Aunt Lady Margaret's dinner. So the family was not too pleased with him. Anyway, in one story that came out of Laura's narrative is the time that John placed his very young son, George, on a spirited horse, and he told him to ride to Bristol because his last seagoing ship was coming into port. And he told George, don't let it land, because if it docks, they're gonna sell it for taxes. Well, George was way too young to do this. He just couldn't do it. So the ship was seized, John was destitute, Lady Margaret died of a broken heart, and all the kids were scattered to family, to tradespeople. George was apprenticed to a blacksmith. And Laura states in some of her writings that she found in that house in Fordyce her grandfather's horse books, and that they always referred to him as the horse doctor of Fordyce. So anyway, before we move on, I'm going to tell you what we know about John Elms. Later in life, he followed his sons to the United States, and he started a nursery in Missouri. And toward the end of his life, he sold the nursery, he changed all of his money into gold, and he started out for California in a horse and wagon and was never heard of again. So that's what happened to her great-grandfather. It didn't sound like it was very good. But anyway, Laura's grandfather, George, met her grandmother, Sarah Ann, in England after she had broken off her engagement with a man called Cockney Dick. Now, Sarah Ann and Cockney Dick were shopping the day before their wedding in the village, and Sarah Ann ran into one of her girlfriends, and they're laughing and they're talking about what's going to happen at the wedding and whatever, and Cockney Dick said to Sarah, come along. And she took her good old sweet time and didn't do it, and Cockney Dick grabbed her by the arm and he said, tomorrow night there'll be no such foolishness, because tomorrow night we'll be married and I'll be the boss. And Sarah Ann said, if that's how it's to be, there'll be no tomorrow night. And so Cockney Dick was shocked. There was no wedding. And Laura's quote on this little story is, there is many a slip betwixt the cup and the lip, and that was one of them. She's very funny in a lot of her writing. Few words on Sarah Ann's lineage. Her father was a drunkard, and when he left the family, left her mother and all the siblings, they moved in to the estate of Sir Robert Peel, where her grandfather was a caretaker. He was a caretaker of the estate. Apparently Sarah Ann, as a child, never learned to read or write, and according to Laura, they considered her a peasant. Slide. Hopefully, slide. It doesn't want to go. Well, anyway.
I'll get it.
Okay,
Keep going.
I'll keep talking, okay. Anyway, after Sarah and George were married, they were married in England and they had one child. And they decided to follow his brothers to the United States. They traveled on a sailing ship and they landed in Philadelphia in 1854. They continued by coach to Pittsburgh, and they went down the river by boat to Rice's Landing. And when they got there, George only had 25 cents in his pocket, but he hired a road wagon to take Sarah and the baby, and he walked behind it to Swartz. If you don't know where Swartz is, it's a small village above Waynesburg. Later they moved to Waynesburg. George had no job, but Sarah got a job cleaning the new college building that we now know as Hannah Hall. Later, George went into partnership with another blacksmith. The shop was on the corner of Washington and Franklin Street. He also ran a hack line from Waynesburg to Washington. He carried freight and he carried passengers. Soon, he and the partner bought property on the block where the Messenger building is. But the partner lost all the money and hung himself, and George was destitute again. He tried to recover some of his property, but according to Laura, an attorney swindled him of his rights because he was a foreigner, F-U-R-R-I-N-E-R, and that happened in 1861. They left Waynesburg, they went to Graysville with the intention of starting another blacksmith shop, and then the Civil War began. George thought he would enlist as a friar. So he walked to Cameron, West Virginia, and he joined Company C, the 18th Cavalry. Sarah learned to read and write so she could communicate with him while he was away. And also the people in the community asked her to be a nurse because when she was in England, she had contracted smallpox and she was immune. So she nursed while he was away. During the war, George worked as a blacksmith, but he was injured one day when he was moving his tools and a wagon ran over his legs. And the surgeons wanted to amputate and he wouldn't allow it. So in 1865, he was discharged and he suffered his whole life with his legs. Slide. And when he got out of the Civil War, George moved his family to Fordyce. And this is the little house that you saw at the top of the hill across from the blacksmith shop. This is the house. When he and Sarah moved in there, they had 7 children, and they had 5 more. Slide. They had 5 more. We only have 10 here. We have determined that 2 of them must have died in infancy. But he had 5 boys, 5 girls. All the boys were trained as blacksmiths. All the girls were taught to sew. And George decided that he would buy another little house here in Waynesburg, and he would set these girls up as seamstresses. And he did that. He did that. When the boys were older, 4 of them came to Waynesburg, and they established the Elms Brothers Blacksmith Shop, and this was on the alley where the African American Episcopal Church was. And then when they started to get some money, they built a larger house for their sisters and their mother. When the oil and gas industry had the boom here in Greene County, they built the Elms Brothers Machine Shop, which Tom was just asking me about. This machine shop was it was right where Avalon Court is. It's right next door to this building. And that's what the boys were doing, okay? George lived in Fordyce till his death of diabetes in 1890. And Laura writes, quote, "The autumn was wet when grandfather George died, and mud was axle deep on the wagon that took his body from Fordyce to Waynesburg for burial. After George's death, Sarah moved to town with her children and lived in the big house here in Waynesburg." Now, George and Sarah were very religious, and they wanted their children raised in the Episcopal faith. They had come from the Church of England. That was their background. So on July 4th, 1886, Bishop Cortland Whitehead came from Pittsburgh, and he baptized 6 of the Elms children in the house in Fordyce. This ritual of baptisms, followed by a picnic every July 4th, happened for many, many years. And soon, people that were in Greene County and close by locations wanted to become part of this group. So pretty soon, by I think it was 1898, they had enough people that it became a mission. And they needed to choose a name for this mission. Well, Bishop Cortland had a bunch of names, but the Elms family prevailed until they called the mission St. George. In the early 1900s, they had no permanent structure for this church. And so they held the Episcopal services in the living room of the Elms home that was here in Waynesburg. That's what they did. As the church grew, they met many places. They met at other churches, they met in the college, but when they didn't have a place to meet, they went back to the Elms living room. In 1921, St. George Guild was formed to raise money for a permanent structure. The guild was to make linens and vestments for clergy and choir. And in time, this guild's work became so famous, it was all over the United States. They were selling vestments and linens all over the United States. These Elms girls' sewing skills were paying off. It was generating money for a better house, a better church. The Elms house was used for the church services until 1946. And in 1956, Miss Lizzie Elms, who was she was a daughter of George and Sarah. In '56, she was the last owner of that house where they met for the services. She died. She left the house and $8,000 seed money for a permanent structure. Slide. And this came to fruition in 1960 on Boner Avenue. Right there. Okay. Many of you remember seeing that on Boner Avenue. Okay. Now, during the pandemic, the population was getting elderly and it was getting very scarce. And so the diocese decided to disband this group. They sold this property to a faith-based program for adults with developmental disabilities. So that's what happened to that. Okay, slide. All right, Laura's father was William Alfred Elms. He was the 10th child of George and Sarah. And he continued to run the blacksmith shop after his father's death. But Laura's mother, he met her in Fordyce. She had been sent to live with Uncle Johnny. And Uncle Johnny was a school director and he was a well-respected citizen of Fordyce. And according to Laura, he gave her mother the only education she ever had. She eventually went on to become a teacher and she became engaged to William Alfred. However, there was a newly enacted Pennsylvania law that said you had to be 21 or you couldn't get married without consent. And her father would not sign for her. So they had to wait till they were 21, and here's their wedding picture. That's Laura's mother and father. Okay. In Laura's narrative about the mother, I found the clue as to why Laura was researching the Morris family. I could never understand why was Laura researching her divorced husband's Morris family. I couldn't figure that out, but I did find it in this narrative. She writes that Uncle Johnny was the son of a Revolutionary soldier named Jonathan Morris, and he lived on a farm patented in 1786. Jonathan Morris was my third great-grandfather. Therefore, Uncle Johnny was my second great-grandfather. And Uncle Johnny was a brother to Laura's great-grandmother. Laura and I were related. And this clue from her narrative proved invaluable as I started to do my research. Okay, slide. Now here you can see this. This is why. Here's Laura, here's me, okay? The Revolutionary soldier, Jonathan, on the right. His 6th child was Sarah Morris Whitlatch. His 10th child was John Morris, Uncle Johnny. Sarah was Laura's great-grandmother. Uncle Johnny was my second great-grandfather, so we were related. Slide. Now, I go back to this again to show you how the mother and father met. Here's where her father was born, in the George Elms house. And if you go right over on the right, you see the home of John Morris. That's Uncle Johnny. That's my second great-grandfather. If you went off of the screen and down a little bit, in 1875, John Morris and his son, Jonathan, built a new farmhouse. That's the house where I live today. So you can see that here's the Elms house, there's the Morris house, 300 yards across the way. That's how they met. Okay. Slide. William and Elizabeth Alice had 5 children. Their first one was Laura. She was born in 1893. Their second child was Helen, and she died in infancy. The third child was George Gordon Elms. Notice the Gordon is her mother's maiden name. Now, George Gordon was appointed to West Point. Imagine that, from Fordyce. He was appointed to West Point. Here he is in his cadet uniform. Here's his mother standing on a bucket trying to be higher than he is. I don't know why she didn't stand on the step, but she didn't. Anyway, so there he is as a cadet. Here he is in other parts of his uniforms. And the last one, as colonel. He made a colonel. And he was widely traveled and widely respected. And there he is right there. Okay, next. The next child was Anna Margaret, and she was a teacher who graduated from Waynesburg College from the music department. And she was born in 1902. The next one and last one was Alice Holland, born in 1907. Alice also graduated from Waynesburg College. She became a teacher. She traveled the world. A lot of times she traveled with her brother in the military to the Philippines, to Europe, and places like that when war hadn't broken out. Now, if you look at this picture here, here is Alice sitting right beside my Aunt Pauline. And this is another little girl, Madeline Morris, I don't know her. But anyway, my Aunt Pauline, my dad's sister, and Alice were best friends. And this picture was taken in my front yard in the house, in the 1875 house. Here, in this picture, here's my Aunt Pauline in the dark outfit. Alice is standing beside her, and this is by my front porch. If you would go off the picture and up into this area, that's where the Elms home was. If you got onto my porch and looked north, you would see the house of Uncle Johnny. So you can see they were entwined. I never realized they were that entwined until I started to do this research. Okay, slide. At 17, Laura went to school in Morgantown, West Virginia, but she had to leave because her mother was ill. So she came back to Waynesburg Academy and enrolled. She took the teacher's exam. She taught in 3 country schools, and she married a neighbor, Thomas Henry Morris. They lived briefly in Alabama. They lived in West Virginia. And when they came back to Greene County, Laura began to teach again, and Thomas became a mail carrier and a car salesman, if you can imagine that. Slide. Their first child was AJ, Andrew Jackson Morris. You have a connection to that, where you live. Andrew Jackson Morris. He was born in 1915. And then their daughter was born in 1928. That's Ruth Lunette. Now, during the Depression, Laura's husband moved back into his own home with his father. He went to live with his father. And she moved to Waynesburg to live with her father. Her father had moved there in 1923, was widowed in 24, and she moved in with him. They lived near the college. Now, she continued to teach, and she graduated from Waynesburg College in 1930. But in the summer of 1937, she was caught up in a national controversy. In the spring of 37, she'd been teaching at the Bailey Schoolhouse in Whiteley Township, and she was dismissed on charges of cruelty and teaching evolution. Now, 12 years before that, the Scopes trial was held in Tennessee, and John Scopes was found guilty of teaching evolution. He violated what was called the Butler Act, which said you could not teach evolution in a state-sponsored school. 13 different states tried to pass this legislation. Most of them did not make it. But anyway, this was what Laura was facing. Now, so on an August night in 37, Laura tried to get her job back. 200 spectators met at the Bailey School as Laura presented her case. She was accused of hitting students with a baseball bat and a stove poker, in addition to teaching evolution. She was questioned by the assistant superintendent of Greene County Schools and the school board attorney, and she explained that a student had shown her a magazine article on evolution and asked her to explain. Laura said, quote, "I told her there was a theory of evolution worked out by a man named Darwin. I said some people support the theory and others don't. I told her I don't have time to explain it all, but she could read about it in the encyclopedia. The whole thing was passed off as a joke. That was all that was ever said in my schoolroom about evolution," unquote. On cruelty charges, Laura admitted to having to use more than average force to keep a boy named Jack Jones in line. She struck him with a small riding whip, but she never knocked him down. Another time she struck him squarely on the seat with a board. Another day, she broke a board 18.5 inches by 3.5 inches by a half inch on her desk as she struck at him. Another time, Jones tried to drag Laura from the classroom, and she grabbed a coal poker as she was being rushed past the stove. She told Jones if he took one more step, she'd use the poker. And Jones said to her that his dad said she never had to take a licking from Mrs. Morris. The school board attorney stated that several students were not promoted, although the grade book showed they had passing grades. And Laura countered and said several students with incomplete schoolwork, who never should have been advanced to the next grade, were advanced by the teachers who preceded her. Members of the school board refused to testify, and it was divulged that one school board member was more or less responsible for a student suspension the previous term, and Laura had been blamed. Greene County was now in the national spotlight. Reporters started to arrive from New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh. And another thing that impacted this was that there was a newly enacted Pennsylvania teacher tenure law. The State Teachers League was looking for test cases. So this provided a perfect opportunity. The State Teachers League said in an Associated Press dispatch that they would back Mrs. Morris unless charges were proven to make her ineligible. More meetings were held, and by the third meeting, the only building in the township that could hold this crowd was the gaslit Kirby School. And the Kirby School is where the Whiteley Township building is, if you want to know where that is. At the third session, over 500 pages of testimony were compiled. And many of the farmers and the wives and the children spoke on Laura's behalf, saying that the whole thing was a personal feud between her and one family. In the end, Laura was cited with incompetency and cruelty. Incompetency and cruelty, but not evolution. And that was the rationale that they used to not reappoint her. She was not reappointed. So determined, Laura filed an appeal with the Greene County Common Pleas Court in Waynesburg before Judge Challen Wyckoff. Jesse R. Scott represented the school board, and J. Ernest Eshelwood represented Laura. The trial began on September 27, 1937, and lasted 4 days. The courtroom was packed. Cameramen were barred. The judge vowed to conduct this trial on the same high plane as any case to come before the court. Attorneys were to confine their questions to cruelty and incompetency and not evolution. And the judge said he wanted to avoid sending this case to a higher court. In the first 2 days of the trial, there was testimony from the parents and students citing Laura's failure to keep order in the classroom and failing to prepare students for the 8th grade examination. It was disclosed that one parent who circulated a petition to have Mrs. Morris removed was the brother-in-law of the teacher hired to take her place. Laura's attorney argued that charges of not keeping order were too vague. And in a cross-examination, a child said that a boy was whipped not because he knocked down another child, but because he used a racial slur. Also, Laura made a boy take his seat by tapping him on the leg with a mushball bat instead of hitting him. On the third day, parents and students spoke on Laura's behalf, and they refuted much of this derogatory testimony. Laura's brother-in-law was a school bus driver, and he said he overheard children from one particular family say that their parents said they didn't have to listen to Mrs. Morris, and if she didn't watch her steps, she wouldn't teach the rest of the term. When Laura's attorney questioned the school board members, some of them had never even been to the Bailey School, and some stated that the charges against Mrs. Morris were preferred by the patrons of the school. On September 30th, which was the 4th day of the trial, a conference was held in the judge's chamber. Both the appeal and the charges were withdrawn by the contending parties, and the case was dismissed. Laura gave a resignation. She signed a receipt saying she'd been paid in full. And in the end, these children who made the evolution charges at the Bailey Schoolhouse hearings denied in court ever hearing Mrs. Morris say that that man was descended from a woman. After the trial, Laura was divorced in 1940. She went to State Teachers College at Kutztown, Pennsylvania, and she received a degree in library science. She became a librarian at Jefferson Morgan High School, and she retired in 1959. Laura's teaching career spanned from 1911 to 1959. She went from a one-room schoolhouse to a high school, and she died 50 years ago on August 1st, 1972 in State College after a lingering illness. Now Laura was, and that's the last slide, Laura was very interested in history and genealogy, and she spent decades researching the Morris family. They were early pioneers here in Greene County. The sheer number of Morrises was such that an attorney once told Laura, when he was abstracting a deed in Greene County, if he didn't find a Morris as a previous owner, he went back to check his mistake. She was especially interested in the descendants of Jonathan Morris, the Revolutionary soldier, whose sixth child was Sarah, which is Laura's great-grandmother, and his 10th child was John, my great-great-grandfather. That's the one that Laura referred to as Uncle Johnny. As I was typing Laura's manuscripts, containing just thousands and thousands of facts and relationships and endless birth, death, and marriage dates, I came upon a section dealing with the lives of Jonathan, the Revolutionary soldier, and his brothers, who came to Greene County in the 1750s. I was excited about this. However, my biggest surprise came further in the manuscript when I found this quote, "The Morris family," now Morris was my great-grandfather, "the Morris family of Fordyce are the ones to whom I feel most closely related. I knew them all my life and heard my parents describe all of them." In the past, as I studied my genealogy, I collected names and dates of faceless individuals whose daily lives were mysteries to me. And suddenly, I had firsthand accounts that opened a window into the lives of 4 generations of my family. Law revealed such intimate details as personalities, character traits, occupations, travels, many other details that my parents and grandparents had omitted or varnished over to keep me from any unpleasantness. Because of Laura, I now know of each of my grandfather's 7 brothers and sisters with facts, good, bad, and ugly. Because Laura's mother had lived with Uncle Johnny, I now know that my great-great-grandfather was a devoted husband, and that my great-great-grandmother, Charlotte, was dainty and kind, and that as a couple, they were 2 lovable characters. Laura identifies the room where they stayed when they moved into the new farmhouse, the house where I now live. That room where they stayed is where we watched television. And who would have ever known that? Before Laura's manuscripts, I knew nothing about my great-great-grandparents except their names, their birth, and their death dates. I will always be grateful to Laura for her research, and I hope to repay her by typing these manuscripts so that others can benefit as I have. Laura was a force to be reckoned with. She charted her own course in life. She pursued facts and narratives gleaned from countless sources so that others could find their roots. Cornerstone is very, very fortunate to have been the recipient of Laura's energy and her dedication. And at this point, I would like to thank my husband for putting together the PowerPoint. I want to thank Candace for her wonderful Greene connections with all of the different photographs. Many of them were taken from Greene Connections. And I would like to thank David for his enthusiasm in pushing me to do this research. We've got a lovely audience, and if there are any questions, I'll try to answer those now. Otherwise, we are done with Laura Morris.